Welcome to the Autism Housing Network and the Madison House Autism Foundation. My name is Desiree Kameka, and I'm the Director of Community Education, Outreach, and Advocacy. Today, I'm very excited to be able to present to you an array of housing options that I've been able to visit across the country. There really is quite a sense of movement that's happening to be able to solve some of the housing and support crisis that we're facing today in our nation. Madison House realized that the face of a child with autism was really the face of autism, and that we needed to start changing those perspectives. And so we hosted a series of images in Times Square that really depicted those on the spectrum who were adults, and asking the questions, who will support them? Where will they live? Who will hire them? In order to raise the awareness that it's us as a country, as a community, that's going to create the future we seek, because there just aren't enough options. This is Madison. Madison is a young adult. He has to have the latest fashion and sunglasses. He's an artist. And Madison lives at home, for now. You see, when we think about what does the future hold for Madison, we don't want to just think about a program that we're going to put Madison in, or trying to find a place where he could potentially go. What we want to do is ask person-centered questions. Who is Madison? What are the environments in which he thrives? What is it that gives him life? Where does he find value, and who finds him valuable? So what we want to do is be able to give him really the array of choices. Does Madison want to live in an agricultural community? Does he want to live in the city? Does he want to live with others or on his own? As parents, or even as those on the spectrum yourselves, you need to always be asking, what are the supports that I need to be able to live the life of my dreams? In order to understand what are the options available now, we really need to understand the past. We need to know how far we have come in order to see what we can do in the future. There's a lot of policy that has gone into being able to provide public funding so that people can be supported. In the past, people only had the option to be supported and access services in an institutional setting. People were involuntarily segregated. They were viewed as not being able to learn or communicate. They were labeled as dangerous to society. There was a huge stigma to having a disability. They certainly were not a valued part of community. We have come so far. And a lot of it has to do with advocacy. It has to do with people like you who don't want to settle for the status quo. In 1980, the Home and Community-Based Waiver Program started. And what that did was it allowed people to waive the need to be institutionalized in order to access supports and services. So therefore, one can stay in their family home, could go and live in their own home, or can be part of a group home that was within the community. They no longer needed to go to the institutions to access supports and services. They were able to be present in their community. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act came into play. That provided the legal protection of discrimination. So somebody couldn't say, well, you can't lease or you can't be part of this community because you have a disability. People with disabilities now have the protections within the law to be able to live and work in the community or workplace or recreate in the areas of their choice. In 1999, we received even further protections. The Supreme Court's Olmstead decision gave people the right to say, I no longer want to be served in an institution. I need to be served in the community. Previous to that, they may have been stuck in an institutional setting for years and years and years, but because of two brave young women, the Olmstead decision now gives many others the protections from being stuck in an institutional setting and being able to have access to supports in their community. In 2000, the Developmental Disability Assistance and Bill of Rights Act was passed, and that really started to set the change for how we perceive people with disabilities and their abilities. It shifted the orientation that people with disabilities have the right to self-determination, that they have the right to have access to their community, but also to be accepted within their community, and that as much as possible, supports and services should be tailored to an individual. In 2014, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services released new regulations regarding these home and community-based settings to make sure that money was being spent in a place where people had the most choice and control in their home. None of this policy would have been possible if it wasn't for advocates like you. So please, as you continue to look for opportunities, realize that you may be presented with barriers, but those barriers can be overcome. And we will help you here at Madison House to be able to overcome those barriers. So how do these support services get paid for? Well, they can be private pay, so somebody can pay for their support services through Social Security insurance, through supplemental security income. They can be paid for through income that is earned from working. They can be paid for with a special needs trust or through other family support. And soon, many states will have an ABLE account that will allow people to be able to save for further expenses for care. Now, there's additional funding that is provided by the public as well. So that can be done through an intermediate care facility, which historically have been more of the institutional model for funding services. Some individuals live in nursing facilities or psychiatric wards, but we also have the home and community-based waivers to be able to pay for funding. And some states even have opportunities that are completely state-funded and aren't tied to federal dollars. All of the money that comes into each of your states, half of it comes from the federal CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And then it goes to the states, and the states have the authority to be able to create policy and regulations and create the waivers that maybe would meet the needs of their constituents. And then as an individual, you look at the waivers that your state has available, and you decide that you want to apply for those waivers. And you must be eligible. Every state has different eligibility requirements, and most states have a wait list. So it is not necessarily something that you can always rely on immediately after exiting high school. So how is housing paid for? Unless you live in an institutional setting, you have to figure out how you're going to pay for your housing. That can be through affordable housing vouchers, it can be through income earned. There are opportunities in some communities where they have invested in affordable and accessible housing, and so this is housing that has been set aside for those on a limited income. You can also access SNAP, so programs that can help with accessing money for food. There's food pantries in many different communities. If you use a waiver funds cannot be used to pay for housing, so therefore you will have to figure out how to pay for housing in a place where you can access your services. It's only in institutional settings like a nursing facility, a psychiatric ward, or an intermediate care facility where the housing and your supports are tied. And that's really important to understand the difference and the pros and cons of having your supports tied to your home. When a setting is provider-owned or controlled, or when it is an institutional setting, you cannot decide to move somewhere else and necessarily bring your supports with you. Your housing and your services are connected, but there's benefits to that as well. You're not necessarily responsible for the upkeep of the property. If something goes wrong in the home, it's the service provider that's going to ensure immediate action to resolve those type of things, but it does give you less control of your actual home. Whereas consumer-controlled housing is where you control your home and all of the decisions within your home, and then you can set up the contracting for if anything goes wrong with the maintenance or changes, and that provides you with the most control over your home. But if you're looking for housing for someone who has higher support needs, who may not be able to organize those type of opportunities, it's really important to make sure that you're talking about who is going to be the one that steps in when the sink breaks. The predominant models we have today are developmental centers, group homes, being supported in your own family home, being supported in your own home, and adult foster care. So now I'm going to go through the traditional housing and support options in order to provide you with some considerations as well as the benefits of each of these settings, because really it's up to you. It's about the individual that we're trying to serve, and every individual is very different. One size does not fit all. I'm going to read you a quote from the Senior Co-Housing book. "A home is more than a roof over one's head or a financial investment. It affects the quality of a person's general well-being, one's confidence, relationships, and even one's health. It can provide a sense of security and comfort, or elicit feelings of frustration, loneliness, and fear. Before you decide on any home setting, it's really important that you think about, is this a place that my son or daughter or myself will feel secure and safe? These are really important questions to consider because where you live really does influence your health, your well-being, and everything else about your quality of life. So the developmental centers of today, these are sometimes the older institutions of the past. Now they have a much higher staff ratio. It is a very structured and controlled environment. There are typically medical and behavioral teams on site. There are typically planned activities on site as well as off site. And this has been a home for many, many people for decades. Considerations that you need to be aware of when making informed decisions about this type of setting: it's a highly structured environment. Do you want to live in that type of structure? You definitely have limited access to the greater community. An individual who lives there can't decide, oh, I think I want to go to the movies this week. You know, it has to be planned ahead of time with a group. Is that something that is valuable to the person that you're looking for a home and community for? There's limited opportunities to be able to learn life skills. This is an institutional setting. You might live in a room and then you might go to a dining area for your meal in which someone else will prepare for you. Somebody might be able to clean your apartment for you or the room in which you live in. And it's also very important to know that these settings are closing rapidly and that it is not a setting that may be here for the next 30, 40 years. Group homes. This is the next traditional housing option. And of course, it has greater physical access to the community because you're within a typical neighborhood. There are spaces to learn the independent living skills. There's going to be a kitchen and there's going to be a bathroom just like any other home. The property maintenance and coordination of care is typically handled by a service provider. Many group homes are provider owned and controlled, so it's important to understand the implications of that. And group homes can still offer supports for individuals who have higher medical or behavioral needs. Some of the considerations: this is not your property and you may be forced to move. If a group home provider closes, or if the group home provider decides that they need to move to a different house, you can't stay in that home. There is limited choices in direct staffing, so you cannot choose exactly who your staff is going to be in their schedule. Those things are provided for you. Again, there's pros and cons to that depending on the individual. There's limited options for individuals to be able to go out on their own to activities that they like, mainly because of staffing limitations and transportation needs. If you live in a home with 4 other people, if everyone decides that they want to go and see a baseball game, you may not be able to stay home and decline because there may not be staff there. But at the same time, you have a group of friends to go see a baseball game with. Couples may not be allowed to cohabitate, so if you plan on having a romantic relationship in the future, it would be important to know, would my partner be able to live with me in that home? Visitors are often supervised in a group home setting, and there will be a lack of control in the decisions of the household. Yet some people may not need that type of decision-making control. Some people might be okay with others making sure that the home is staying clean and maintained. Let's take a look of a fantastic group home provider. Of course, being supported in your family home. 71% of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and autism live in their family home. You can stay with your family. If you need to make physical adaptations, that is your family home. Everyone can age in place together. There's a transportation safety net when you live in your family home. But you might want to consider, it's sometimes hard to grow up in your family home. I know that I, as a neurotypical, grew so much when I went off to college. Why shouldn't we think that people with autism or other developmental disabilities wouldn't grow as well? Additionally, decades of routine may make it very difficult to transition in the future. And then, of course, at what point will your family member no longer be able to offer support? That could potentially lead to a crisis placement in which you may not have any choice but the next empty bed. So it's really important to consider, if you do want to live in your family home, how are we going to be transitioning in the 10, 20, 30 years in the future? Foster family homes. This is when an individual with a disability goes and lives within another family home. It can be a very family-like and supportive environment. There's less out-of-pocket housing costs for the individual with a developmental disability or autism. And it can be a great option for those who have existing relationships with friends. But again, there's considerations. This is not your home. If the relationship with that foster family changes, that family will not move from their home. You will be the one moving. How many times does an individual have to move before they find the right fit with a host family home? What happens to the structure of one's social life and employment opportunities if they are forced to move in the future? In some states, adult foster care is being termed shared living. I'd like to make a point that shared living is a little bit different. Shared living is when an individual with a disability and an individual without a disability share a home. They have equal access and authority to that home. So if their relationship changes, the person with the disability or autism is not automatically the person who's going to have to move. It might be the roommate or residential assistant that would be the one that was forced to move. So it really gives people with disabilities the opportunity to have a more stable housing environment. I think considerations are, is an individual ready to have a live-in roommate? With a roommate, you have a different type of social structure and relationship. Being able to create very clear boundaries on when somebody can access support and request support, and then when somebody is over-relying on that individual can cause some tension in conversation. So it's really important to make sure you create clear boundaries on what is expected from the support person, and then also what type of social relationship you would like to have with that person as well. One of my favorite models of shared living comes from L'Arche. L'Arche communities were started abroad. There's hundreds of communities across the country. It's a beautiful model for shared living. Several individuals with disabilities live in one home, and they're called the core members. And then there's other neurotypical individuals that also live in the home just as roommates, and they're called assistants. So I'd like to show you this video of an example of L'Arche in Washington, D.C. So I've had the opportunity to visit several L'Arche communities across the country. And one of the things that was highlighted is being able to get around the table. And L'Arche communities invite others to do so. So if you live somewhere near a L'Arche community, I suggest that you say, hey, can I come and take a look at what it means to live in a shared living environment? You'll be able to go and share a meal with them and really see what it means to be in that type of relationship with someone, an interdependent relationship. I have a story. I went to a community in DC, and I got to be there while they were preparing the meal, and I helped set the table just like everybody else. And they kept calling for one of the core members to come down for dinner. And we were calling and calling and waiting and waiting. Finally, he comes down, doesn't make eye contact with anyone, sits down at the table, very serious, and everyone was asked to pray in their own way of expression. And so we all went around the table and gave our prayer, and it was his turn. And he put his hands on the table and looked up and started singing, "Row, row, row your boat." And then we all started singing with him, "Row, row, row your boat." And it ended with, "Amen." And to be in that space where people just get you in those type of ways means a lot. There's no social standard that you have to adhere to. You don't have someone else telling you that, well, that's not how you pray. They just know him, and that's how he likes to pray, and we're okay with that, and we're going to pray all together that way. That type of relationship is very unique and a very beautiful thing. Of course, you can be supported in your own home. You can find a place to live, maybe an apartment or a home. You can choose to have roommates or not. You can select who your staff is going to be, how they're going to support you. It's certainly the most individualized way to be supported and to have control of your home. Some people won't be able to find homes that they can afford, but there are affordable housing vouchers that people can try to access. Typically, they don't have a wait list. The application process might be open for specific days in certain years. There's certainly not enough to meet the demand, but it's worth at least going and trying to get on a wait list or putting in your application, because then you would only have to be able to pay 30% of your income and everything else would be subsidized for a home or apartment of your choice. There are considerations to being supported in your own home. One, it's very hard to find affordable, accessible housing, especially affordable, accessible housing that is near public transportation. So you won't be trapped in your home, but you'll be able to kind of get out and move around, or a home that is walkable to a grocery store, a supermarket, or a movie theater, or some shops. Market rate rent is not fixed. It's important to take into consideration a home that you choose or an apartment that you choose that you can afford this year may not be affordable next year. I get many calls from people saying, my rent has been raised, what can I do? I don't have the extra income, I'm living off of X, Y, and Z. In those cases, either somebody is forced to take on a roommate or they're going to have to move. There's less accountability for one-to-one staff. For some individuals who are able to say very easily, this person is taking advantage of me, that can be okay. But for somebody who has limited communication or verbal abilities, it might be a little bit more risky. The person that you hire may turn out to be a different person than the person you thought you hired. And where is that space of accountability where an individual who has limited communication skills is able to say, this person is taking advantage of me in this place? It's really important that people with disabilities who move into a typical apartment setting or maybe a neighborhood, that they're going to have to get ready for discrimination. Unfortunately, even now in 2016, discrimination happens. Also, people look for people to prey off of. I have had many stories, and I'll share one with you about my good friend who lived in a group home and lived in his family home and finally had his apartment, right? He had his voucher, he had his waiver funding, and he met a friend. And this friend and him fell in love. And this friend said, oh, we should move across state lines. I know of a place where we can live over here. Well, when he moved, he lost his housing voucher, he lost his waiver supports, and then his friend took control of his finances. Soon after that, he was calling us saying, I have no money, I'm homeless, I need to get back to my home state. And so it's important to recognize that sometimes predatory relationships can really disrupt one's supports and housing. And is someone ready to be able to identify those type of predatory relationships? This is a video that Madison House created to try to provide a sense of where people with developmental disabilities and autism are living across the country, but also the lack of growth of those housing and support options.